Okay, everybody, hello again. It's time to do something that YouTubers do, which is react to reactions. It is getting so funny now. We'll get recursive soon enough. Let's hope we don't get into a Stack Overflow or something. But anyway, what we wanted to do just briefly is to go through some of the answers that Rebecca and Mathias have written to us on Twitter related to some things that we talked about in our last reaction video on their article, Design and Reality. And I think they made a few very great points, and this is mainly why I'd like to go through those, because there's much more to learn here. So let's get started. First of all, for those of you who don't know, we recorded a video where we read this article, Design and Reality. Watch this video if you haven't, but I think the story is very, very interesting. So, and the learnings for design, right? Adi?
Yes, of course. It's very interesting and very out of the real world, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's coming from a real experience. It's really something that is, how to say, it's an act of design, quite sophisticated. There's a lot of sophistication there, not something that we often see. Right.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'd like to go through a few things. So we said in the beginning, when we introduced domain-driven design, that one consequence of domain-driven design was event sourcing. And event sourcing is about storing actions or events, as they call them, instead of storing the actual data, right? That would be a description of domain-driven design. And we stated one problem. I stated one problem with event sourcing, which is that when you have GDPR coming, after you have these event sourcing systems, you might get into trouble because everything is stored in events, right? And so deleting a piece of information that is requested by GDPR means that you need to go and delete from all the events. And then there's also a challenge that perhaps you have these events dependent on one another. One idea with event sourcing is replayability. So the ability to go back in time, replay those events, and see what the system status, I guess, was at a certain point in time, right? I hope I'm getting this correct, Adi.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Mathias answered with something that was very interesting. He wrote two patterns that address this problem. And that's something that I found quite interesting. Now, we won't go into a lot of details. Fundamentally, you have... So the first one is called Forgettable Payloads. And what it says is store the sensitive payload of an event in a separate store to control access and removal. So what you would do in case of, let's say, GDPR, there are some data that is related to people, like, I don't know, name, address, email, phone number, whatever else. And then what you can do is to have two event stores. One of them that stores basically your data, and the other one that stores all this information. And because you do that, you can then go back and remove this information. And you store a reference to the payload's location in the database, and you need to request basically from two databases, right? If you want to retrieve the data, you would ask two databases. So I found it as a very interesting pattern. It makes a lot of sense. And the second one that he is kind of similar idea, only it's called crypto shredding. And the idea is you encrypt sensitive information in an event and delete the key. And in this case, you have the information, but it's encrypted that you cannot recover it anymore. It's like you don't have it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I think these two are very interesting. I don't want to go into a lot of details. I mean, it's worth probably reading those all by themselves. But for people who are dealing with such challenges, I think it's worth taking a look. What do you think?
I think it's important to know that there are solutions, and it's always a matter of searching, or if, okay, maybe there aren't yet, but you can find solutions if no one else wrote or thought about this. But already event sourcing has matured a lot over the years, and I think any problem would find a solution, or if you dig well enough, if you search well enough, you'll find enough solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So anyway, I found this very interesting, and I think that you can apply similar patterns even if you don't do event sourcing. I mean,
Yeah, definitely.
right? You can apply. I can almost see how you could have a separate database for things like names, addresses, and so on. Reference the ID from this database and then have the logic in your code that if in case this information does not exist, you don't display it, but you just treat it normally. I mean, it's a normal case in your application. So I don't see this as a problem. Now I asked something else to Mathias, which was, okay, so what I understand is that these patterns work after something like GDPR is enacted. But what do you do if you already have your event source and then you get GDPR enacted? Right? And his answer was that's basically a database migration. So it should be fairly easy to do.
Yes.
Okay. So
I think if you use event sourcing well, there are solutions. The thing with this is that you need to respect some really clear guidelines, and all in all, they come from, I don't know, better design judgment, but you also can have kind of rules to apply.
Yeah, and I think one challenge would be if you have some kind of dependencies between events based on time. Because then if you have, or what you would call it, connaissance of time, because then you might have some challenges with making the migration. But yeah, so try to avoid these things, and I'm sure there is some literature about it. Right, so I thought it was cool. Now the second thing that he said is, as for the remark about DDD and big design upfront, we noted that many teams that we've seen apply domain-driven design as big design upfront. So I don't know what's your experience, but from my experience, we see either teams that don't apply domain-driven design at all, or domains that think, okay, this will solve all our problems, let's just do domain modeling and go to microservices or whatever, and that will solve all our problems.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very typical approach when there isn't enough experience in architecture and design. I saw also approaches where DDD was used okay-ish, let's say, with a lot of emphasis on really trying to do good things. But yeah, there is this situation, especially when you think of DDD as a tool for everything, as a solution for everything. And any tool is useful in certain contexts. And that's why I think, yeah, typically when you're missing the experience in that team, or you're missing the design judgment, architecture experience, you'll start seeing these exaggerations,
Yeah. And so he pointed me to this Whirlpool process of model exploration that was written by Eric Evans. And it's actually a diagram. And we can quickly look at it. Fundamentally, what it's trying to say is that you see here, there's a big explosion or a big crash. It says, okay, challenge model with new scenario. So what he means is really incremental improvements on your model, on your understanding of the model. And if you look around here, you're talking about stories, scenarios, walking through. So picking some scenarios, walking through the domain, and figure out, there's a lot of things happening here. Scenario, model, code probe, experiments, thinking about other models, and so on. And okay, so what do you think about this? Because I already stated my opinion on Twitter, and I'll go last.
Again, I think it's something useful. It's obviously the way to go incrementally, and to consider your model as a hypothesis that needs a lot of proof, and not just as the solution, the only solution, and then let's go on and let's develop the next 5 years on top of it, or next 15 years on top of it.
Yeah.
Again, going to the situation where you see unexperienced teams, you're missing this as well. And also there's I think an issue in many teams about experimentation, and knowing how to experiment, knowing how to put their ideas under pressure, because this is what we see here.
Yeah.
Basically, any design, even if we talk about a chair, a building, if we talk about software or a nuclear plant, any design needs to be put under pressure before you start working on it and build it. So you need to have a way of trying to figure out if that design makes sense. So for building, you might create, now you have beautiful softwares that, in a way, show you all the forces for all the structural elements and so on. And you put it in an earthquake and you see what happens and so on. So that's a lot of work done by engineers over tens of years and trying to figure this out. Or I don't know, an airplane you'll put in an air tunnel and see what happens, increasing speed, and if something goes wrong, how it reacts and so on. So you need to find these ways of experimenting with your model as well. And here I think the issue is that we're missing a lot of this, and probably this is why you see domain-driven design as a big design up front, because there is lack of experimentation, there is lack of testing the design, of putting it under pressure even before you start working on it.
Yeah. And I would add not only that, but if you think about any other design discipline, you never start working on the first solution that comes into your mind and that works.
Yes.
You will never have, let's say, for example, you want to become an industrial designer and you go through a design school. One of the first things that you need to do is usually create a chair or something similar, but let's go with a chair. but you never get a grade for just coming with one chair. You need to come with 10 different chair models and show the differences between them, and maybe one model that you built as a prototype.
Mm-hmm.
But that's
and you need to break your chair. You need to break the chair and see where it breaks. Where is the issue? And you need to see the usage of the chair, because there's one. It's the same with software. There's one thing about a chair that you use in your living room and you sit nicely on it, or a chair that will be used in, I don't know, a conference hall at the hotel or at the restaurant. Where you never know what happens, how many times it gets hit, and so on. So you need to look at this as well, and make the appropriate testing for the model.
Yeah. So if you think that you cannot have a lot of variations of chairs, there's a museum in Copenhagen that's called the Design Museum, which I visited, I think, about 5 times while I was working there with a customer, and it has a huge collection of chairs, and I was always fascinated by the variations. It's so great. And I actually did a talk using chairs as a model. All right, but going back here, one criticism I would have for this diagram, if you show it to the teams that we usually work with, they will not understand what it's about.
Oh yeah, definitely. But with diagrams, that's an issue anyway. I think it's difficult to create a diagram that anyone understands, especially when we talk about some of these topics where you need the experience, you need the background. I wouldn't show this. I would more go into the depth or in the background of what you need. As I said, about experimentation, about stress test of your model, about incremental work, and all these things that you need to know before you can understand this concept of the whirlpool.
Yeah. And so I like the idea, model exploration whirlpool. It looks like a whirlpool. It's really cool. It kind of, you put the model inside the whirlpool and you kind of rotate it, and until you, I guess you get out all the things that are not great. But the metaphor is great, but the practice is, my lord, that's another thing.
Yes. One thing here about the model and this idea of the whirlpool, what I quite see, especially with more unexperienced teams, is that all the stress scenarios they come up with, they're not really stress scenarios. They're more like functional, normal, day to day. I don't know why. Maybe you need a lot of imagination or on what could go wrong, or maybe you just need experience, or you need to read about what went wrong with similar systems. But because there's another risk here, that you start coming up with stress scenarios that are in fact very normal, and you say, okay, we tested the design, everything's good. So if you created a test, if you tried to test your model and everything went good, I'd question your tests, especially if it's a new one. There is something wrong with your tests. It cannot be that your model is perfect.
Yeah, it's like I say about reliability tests. If you do reliability tests and everything works well, then probably you haven't done enough reliability tests.
Yes.
A successful reliability test is when your application fails to work.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And this is a weird idea, I think. I think that
it's weird for developers, but it's very natural for testers.
Yeah, I think this is the main challenge. At least from what I've seen, developers tend to be very focused on making things work. This is what brings us joy. This is what makes us happy. But at the same time, we forget that, the world is more complicated than our computers and IDs and so on. Things will go pretty badly once you start putting your application in the real world.
Mm.
All right, so this was, Rebecca answered to this. Definitely people can misunderstand, misapply almost any modeling technique. Trust me, she has experience with this ever since I guess it was the 60s with object-oriented design.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
people still misunderstand and misapply object-oriented design today. So
definitely.
Eric has a background of incremental exploration and modeling with coding to prove out ideas. So this is what designers do, right? Designers do incremental exploration, they do incremental modeling, they do prototypes to prove out ideas,
Mhm.
and sometimes to rule out ideas.
Mhm.
Because if all your prototypes are successful, something is wrong. You haven't tried enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but very interesting, I think. I really enjoy this discussion. Okay. The next one is about you. You made some remarks about testing, but the problems you describe wouldn't turn up in testing. Just briefly, the scenario described was in an oil rig. You get an alarm because of some pressure changes in the equipment, and the alarms were also considered. So the starting and stopping of alarms was also considered the time for solving that issue in the initial model that they were talking about. And what they discovered is that actually what happens, a lot of alarms go on or go off actually. Engineers stop them because they need to think and they cannot think while the alarms are ringing, and then they solve the issues. So because of that, they actually had to separate another domain entity. And you said something about testing, but the problems we described wouldn't turn up during testing. I guess because it's a disaster scenario. The sensors and alarm and off button work as specified. Even the usage during prolonged incidents is correct. And here is something that is interesting to me, and I think, well, first of all, you are talking, I think, about usability tests at this point, right?
Exactly. So functional tests would show okay, because that's how the system functions. When you close it, it says that the alert is gone. So yeah, nothing to test there. But for usability tests, and I need to explain what I would do here and how I would start a system like that, is I would ask an engineer from that oil rig to, so I would put on an alarm and put exactly a scenario like there's an alarm, and I would just ask, okay, so what do you do now? So try this with a few engineers, maybe more, I don't know, half a dozen, see what they do. And if all of them would stop the alarm and then start thinking, there you go, there is your usability test. So you don't even need to have a system for that. You just need, I don't know, an alarm and a button to stop the alarm.
Yeah, and just to make sure that we all understand each other, I'm pretty sure that if we were in the same situation as Rebecca was, I'm sure she did the best. I mean,
Yeah, of course.
She has a lot of experience. This is not a criticism for Rebecca or for Mathias, or
but
but we were just thinking about how things are done in the industry, basically.
Mhm.
Because what this shows me is that they got some specifications done by somebody. Okay. And the model responded to the specification, but you already have this step in between where you translate some of the things that are happening in the real world.
Mhm.
And this is where you can lose information.
Exactly, but I think so. If I were in the situation, I probably would have missed it,
Yeah.
and I don't know even if I would have done that usability test as explained. But looking after it, looking after the fact, it's very easy
Of
to
course.
say. It's
Hindsight
always
is,
easy
yeah.
after the fact to say, "Oh, you should have done that." Sure, but that's why stories like that are a very good way of making us learn about what we could do in similar situations, and that's why I think this story is extremely good and powerful and nice
Yeah.
because it shows the real world, and you can learn maybe what you could try to do in the beginning, but also how to fix such a thing.
Yeah.
And even like that, I am sure that many of us in a similar situation would miss
Yeah.
thinking about usability tests, or would miss some of the tests that you need to do, some functional tests, or they would miss pushing or testing the design for some situations.
Yeah, or we would just miss another domain entity or another part of the domain.
So it's impossible to make it perfect. If you look afterwards, of course, I was missing that. But
Yeah.
before, it's so difficult. So it's not, and I think that's maybe one of the frustrations of some inexperienced people, that they never make it right.
Yeah.
It's never perfect.
But it never is. It never will be.
Never is, exactly. So get used to it. It will crash, and it's normal because perfection is extremely costly, almost unattainable. But trying to go towards perfection is extremely costly. So who would
Yeah.
have the time and money to have such a perfect system?
And Rebecca added that usability testing with disaster scenarios might have, but that is not part of most people's testing toolkit. Absolutely. I also know about another technique, which is actually shadowing. So you could do, but this time you see, the challenge is shadowing is usually an analysis type of activity and done by business analysts and not by designers, which is a bit weird because, well, kind of everybody's a designer in these situations.
Yeah.
But basically, what you could do is shadowing during a drill, during a disaster drill. So actually be there on the rig and see how engineers behave, during an exercise, because it's harder to produce the actual incident. And you don't want that just to make your application nice. But even this, we have to acknowledge that even this, first of all, you need to think about the technique, you need to think about the scenario, you need to be willing to invest in doing this because it's costly. You need to take those engineers out of work for a while and and so on. So yeah, none of these things are easy, right?
No, when we talk about them, they seem very easy. They're not, and we will miss things. Things will go wrong, even after many tryouts, many tests, many prototypes, many everything, many experiments. They will go wrong, and sometimes you'll have such a situation.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me that so I've recently read Donald Norman's book on emotional design, as I was mentioning, and I also went back on my notes on his book on the design of everyday things. And one of his analysis is about the nuclear incident at 3 Mile Island in US, where what turned out to be the problem is that the operators there at the nuclear facility, they had a system, so with a lot of buttons, designed very neatly. So the buttons were very well organized, and they looked really nice and with equal spacing between them and so on. Perfect design. The design looked nice and so on. But it turns out that it didn't help operators when they had to do something quickly, because all the buttons kind of look the same. And this is a very old story about usability, and usability is still design. So it would be nice to, at least one thing that I'd wish is that we keep learning from these stories. Right. Okay, but anyway, the very interesting part, and the reason we're doing this is because of the nuggets of wisdom that come out of it. And we already look at some patterns and so on, but this is a great story, again by Rebecca. Answering, she says, I once worked with a telco client and we discussed how many points of simultaneous software failure should we design for. The answer was 1. More than that would be too difficult to reason about appropriate recovery responses. And no lives would be lost, but there was hardware redundancy. So I find this very interesting, and there's just a question for you. So if you are watching this, how often have you asked this question? How many points of simultaneous software failure should we design for? This is an extremely sophisticated design question.
Yeah, almost. It annoys me that most architects I have worked with don't even think about which are the points of failure. They don't even know them. So it's very sophisticated problem indeed.
Yeah. And of course, well, this is very important. No lives would be lost because it depends a lot what type of system you are working on, right? There is a classification of system, life critical. I think it's something like, I don't remember the exact words, but it's so the most difficult category is the one that deals with lives, and if the system fails, that you may lose lives. Then you may lose money, which is the second, and the third is the one where, okay, you lose some time or something like that, but is not that important. And the designs for these things need to be very differently, approached in a very different way, because it's very different, right? How you deal with those. But still, this is a question that architects should ask, no matter what type of application you do. Even if the answer is 0, and we say, okay, we don't care. If it fails, it fails. We'll repair it soon enough. Okay. It is what it is. But if it's 2, then you already need to treat your architecture differently.
Yep.
All right. So this was it. I thought it was very interesting to go through these answers, because once again they show, and I have to thank Rebecca and Mathias for being so responsive and answering and contributing with these nuggets of wisdom. because I couldn't have dreamed more. I mean, for me, these types of videos are about reading some articles that I really wanted to read, but I never got the time to to get to them, and actually reading them very carefully and trying to understand them as we go. And hopefully this also helps you, everybody who watches, learn more about this domain, or at least start the conversation and figure out how we can get better, right? And these answers by Rebecca and Mathias just point us to even more interesting things to look at. So I can only thank them for that. Anything you want to say, Adi, in the end?
No, I mean these are, I don't know, what we saw in the tweets are typical discussions you have, or well, we used to have before the pandemic, but we still sometimes have about this type of topics. And I think this is a very good way of learning, just chatting, discussing about very interesting situations like this. So if someone asks, how could I become a better designer or an architect? Try to have conversations, meaningful conversations about topics like this. And I think over time you start gaining more experience just because you talk about these topics.
Cool. Okay, this is it for now. And well, what can I say? Like, share, subscribe, tell other people, start some conversations, start a reading club, read some patterns, you know, tell us about articles that you'd like us to read and talk about. And until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart.